The first time I realized my daughter was slipping away from me. It wasn't accompanied by a sudden tragedy or a midnight phone call that makes your blood run cold. It was the creeping, insidious nature of unanswered texts and shortened conversations. 5 months of silence does not announce itself all at once. It builds like dust in an empty room, settling over everything. Until you can no longer ignore the gray film, covering what used to be vibrant and alive. I am a widow living in Toronto, a city that knows a thing or two about long, bitter winters. But the cold that began to settle in my chest had nothing to do with the snow outside my window. It had to do with the sudden, unnatural winter that had taken over my daughter Sarah's life down in Texas. I have always been a practical woman. When my husband passed away, he left me with a comfortable life and a clear directive: protect the family. I took that seriously. When Sarah married David 3 years ago, I didn't just offer my blessing. I offered a foundation. I fully funded the down payment on their sprawling house in the suburbs. And I provided the capital to open Sarah's physical therapy clinic. I didn't do it to buy her loyalty, and I certainly didn't do it to control her. I did it because the world is hard enough, and I wanted my child to have a shield. For the first 2 years, that shield held. Sarah would call me on her drive home from the clinic, her voice bubbling with the kind of exhausted joy that comes from building your own dream. She would tell me about her patients, the new paint in her office, the small, mundane details that mothers live for. Then, David quit his corporate job. He called it a pivot. He said he was going to manage the business side of Sarah's clinic, that they were going to be a power couple. I didn't say what I was thinking. That a man who needs his wife's money to feel powerful is a man who will eventually resent her for it. I kept my mouth shut and my checkbook open, setting up a dedicated emergency medical and business fund that they could draw from if things got tight. But after David stepped into the clinic, Sarah's voice began to change. The bubbling joy thinned out into a forced, brittle cheerfulness. Her daily calls turned into weekly texts. Then, 5 months ago, the texts became sporadic, one-word answers. Fine. Busy. Tired. I told myself it was the stress of a young marriage. I told myself that running a business is consuming. I played the role of the understanding, distant mother who doesn't meddle. But pride is a terrible substitute for intuition. Every time I looked at my phone and saw a message left on read, that familiar, irritating pull under my ribs tightened. The kind of pull that tells an older woman she is being lied to, even if she can't yet see the liar's face. The breaking point arrived on a Tuesday. I was sitting at my kitchen island, nursing a cup of black coffee, watching the frost melt on the window pane when my tablet chimed with an alert from my wealth management portal. It was a notification for the emergency medical fund I had set up for Sarah, an account that was strictly supposed to be a safety net. I opened the alert, expecting to see a charge for an MRI machine or clinic supplies. Instead, the merchant name stared back at me, completely incongruous with the life my daughter was supposed to be living. Diamond VIP excursion, Mediterranean Port Authority. The amount was staggering. It wasn't a mistake. It wasn't a misclick. It was a massive, deliberate hemorrhage of funds, designated for a luxury experience halfway across the world. I stared at the screen until the numbers blurred. I tried calling Sarah immediately. The line rang once, then clicked over to a generic voicemail. I tried David. Straight to voicemail. I didn't leave a message. Leaving a message is what you do when you still believe the other person intends to call you back. If you are watching this right now, tell me what time it is where you are. Tell me, because I remember the exact minute the clock on my stove ticked over to 9 a.m. And I realized that I was done waiting for permission to be a mother. I closed my tablet, walked into my bedroom, and pulled a small, hard-shell suitcase from the top of my closet. I packed exactly what a woman needs. when she is flying across the continent to break open a locked door. Two sensible outfits, my passport, and a manila folder filled with every financial document, deed, and transfer record I had ever signed for them. I didn't pack like a grandmother going for a visit. I packed like an auditor. The flight from Toronto to Texas was long enough for my initial shock to harden into something dense and cold. I didn't watch the In-Light movie. I didn't eat the peanuts. I sat by the window, watching the clouds shift from gray to blinding white, replaying the last 5 months of silence in my head. I thought about the way David used to smile at me. Too wide, too eager, like a salesman trying to close a deal he knew was overpriced. I thought about how Sarah had stopped mentioning him in her brief texts. When the plane finally touched down in the sweltering Texas heat, I bypassed the baggage claim, walked straight to the taxi stand, and gave the driver the address of the house I had paid for. The neighborhood was one of those pristine, gated communities, where the lawns are manicured with mathematical precision and the silence feels expensive. The taxi pulled up to the curb, and I paid the driver in cash, telling him I wouldn't be needing a return trip. I stood on the sidewalk and looked at the house. It was beautiful, 2 stories of brick and white trim, but it looked entirely dead. The blinds were drawn tight, pulled down like eyelids refusing to wake up. Sarah's car was not in the driveway. David's SUV was missing. The silence of the street was interrupted only by the low hum of an air conditioning unit kicking on somewhere in the distance. I walked up the paved driveway, the Texas heat pressing against my dark coat, but I didn't sweat. I felt entirely composed, my body moving on a track that had been laid down the moment I saw that bank charge. I reached the porch and looked down. The mailbox was overflowing. Envelopes were crammed into the metal slot, some spilling out onto the welcome mat. They weren't just junk mail. They were final notices, utility warnings, envelopes stamped with urgent red lettering. Men who are managing a business properly do not let their home mailbox vomit final notices onto the front porch. I used the spare key Sarah had mailed me 3 years ago. It slid into the lock with a rusty complaint, telling me it hadn't been used in a long time. I turned the handle and pushed the door open. The air inside the house hit me immediately, stale, warm, and thick with the smell of trapped dust. It smelled like a place that had been abandoned in the middle of a sentence. I stepped into the foyer, my sensible shoes clicking too loudly against the hardwood floor. "Sarah," I called out. My voice didn't echo. It was swallowed by the heavy, suffocating quiet. I walked through the living room. It was disturbingly neat, but not in a clean way. It was neat in the way a hotel room is neat after the guests have checked out. There were no throw pillows out of place, no magazines on the coffee table, no lingering scent of perfume or cooking. I moved toward the kitchen, my eyes scanning the counters. A single coffee mug sat in the sink, ringed with dried, ancient residue. On the island, a stack of unopened mail mirrored the mess on the porch. I didn't run. I walked methodically upstairs to the master bedroom. The bed was made, the comforter pulled up perfectly tight. But when I opened Sarah's closet, my breath caught. It wasn't empty, but the clothes were pushed haphazardly to one side. A few hangers lay broken on the floor. It didn't look like packing for a trip. It looked like someone grabbing things in a panic. I checked the bathroom. Sarah's toothbrush was gone. Her daily medications were gone. David's expensive colognes still sat neatly lined up on his side of the vanity, undisturbed, mocking me with their presence. My irritation evaporated, replaced by a deep, nauseating dread. Something had happened here. Something violent enough to clear my daughter out of her own home, but quiet enough that the neighbors hadn't noticed. I left the house, locking the door firmly behind me, and called an Uber. There was only one other place she could be: the clinic. The ride to the commercial district took 20 minutes, but it felt like hours. I watched the Texas strip malls roll by, my hands folded tightly over my purse. the manila folder inside feeling heavier by the second. When the car pulled up to the sleek, modern building that housed Sarah's physical therapy practice, my heart gave a strange, hopeful flutter. The lights were on. There were cars in the parking lot. Maybe I had overreacted. Maybe she was just overwhelmed with work, and David was the one mismanaging the funds. I pushed through the glass doors, the bell chiming brightly above my head. The waiting area was busy, patients sitting in chairs, reading magazines. Behind the reception desk sat a young woman I didn't recognize. She looked up, offering a polite, practiced smile. "Hi there, how can I help you?" she asked. "I'm looking for Sarah," I said, my voice steady, projecting an authority I was currently borrowing from my adrenaline. "I'm her mother, Mrs. Grant. I just flew in." The receptionist's smile faltered. It didn't just drop, it completely vanished, replaced by a look of profound, uncomfortable shock. She glanced nervously toward the closed doors of the treatment rooms, then back to me. She swallowed hard. "Mrs. Grant, Sarah's mother." "Yes," I repeated, the dread returning, wrapping its cold fingers around my throat. "Is she with a patient? I can wait." "Ma'am," the young woman whispered, leaning over the counter, her voice dropping so the patients in the waiting room couldn't hear. "Sarah hasn't been here in 2 months." The room seemed to tilt. 2 months, I echoed, the words tasting like ash. "Where is she? Is David managing the clinic?" The receptionist looked terrified now, her eyes starting around, as if she expected David to materialize from the shadows. "David comes in occasionally to collect the mail and check the accounts. He told us. He told us Sarah had a terrible accident at home. A bad fall down the stairs. He said her leg was shattered in 3 places, and she had a head injury. He told everyone she was resting at home, but..." She stopped, biting her lip, her eyes filling with unspilled tears. "But what?" I demanded, leaning closer, my hands gripping the edge of the reception desk so hard my knuckles turned white. "Tell me the truth." "My cousin works as an orderly on the east side of town," she breathed out, her voice barely a thread. "She saw Sarah." "She's not at home, Mrs. Grant. David put her in Oak Ridge. It's a state-run rehabilitation facility. It's not a good place. It's where the county sends people who don't have private insurance. David told the staff here that the insurance lapsed and he couldn't afford a private center. We didn't know how to reach you. A state-run facility for indigent care." While a luxury Mediterranean excursion charge sat glowing on my bank statement, I didn't scream. I didn't collapse against the desk. The anger that flooded my system was so pure, so absolute, that it bypassed all panic and went straight into military execution. I asked the receptionist for the exact address, wrote it down on the back of a business card, and walked back out into the blinding Texas sun. Oak Ridge Rehabilitation Center looked exactly like what it was. A forgotten warehouse for human suffering. It sat on the edge of the county line, a long, sprawling, single-story brick building surrounded by a chain-link fence. The parking lot was full of potholes, and the thin patches of grass near the entrance were baked brown by the sun. It smelled of industrial bleach and boiled vegetables the moment the automatic doors slid open. There was no busy waiting room here. Just a tired-looking security guard and a nurse behind bulletproof glass. I walked up to the window and slipped my Canadian passport and my daughter's birth certificate under the slot. I didn't ask for permission. I didn't play the worried grandmother. I spoke with the cadence of a judge handing down a sentence. "I am here to see Sarah Bennett. I am her mother, and I am her primary financial sponsor. Tell me what room she is in." The nurse looked at my documents, then up at my face. She didn't argue. She typed the name into her antiquated computer, sighed, and pointed down a long, dimly lit corridor that smelled of age and despair. "Room 412. B bed. Visitors are supposed to sign in, but just go." She needs somebody. The walk down that hallway felt like descending into a nightmare. The fluorescent lights flickered, casting a sickly yellow pallor over the linoleum floor. I passed open doors where elderly patients lay staring at the ceiling, ignored by the understaffed aides rushing past with carts of linen. The noise of a blaring television echoed off the cinder-block walls, competing with the sound of someone coughing violently a few doors down. This was the place David had dumped my daughter. This was the dark, forgotten corner where he had hidden her, while he drained the life I had built for them. I reached room 412. The door was half open. I placed my hand against the painted wood and pushed it gently. The room was cramped, holding two narrow beds separated by a thin, faded curtain. The bed near the door was empty. The bed by the window, bathed in the harsh, unforgiving light of the afternoon sun, was occupied. I stepped into the room, my sensible shoes making no sound. I stopped at the foot of the bed. The woman lying there was so small, so diminished, that for a terrifying second, my brain refused to recognize her. Her right leg was elevated, encased in a massive, brutal-looking external fixator. Metal pins piercing straight through her skin and into the bone. Her face was pale, drawn tight over her cheekbones, and dark, purple shadows bruised the delicate skin under her eyes. Her hair, which used to be so thick and shiny, was matted and dull. But it was her eyes that broke me. She was staring blankly at the wall, her gaze flat and hollow, stripped of all the joy I used to hear through the phone. She looked like a prisoner of war. "Sarah," I whispered. The word barely made it out of my throat. She flinched, a full-body tremor that rattled the metal bed frame. She turned her head slowly, painfully, as if the movement cost her dear. Her eyes struggled to focus in the harsh light, sliding over my dark coat, my purse, and finally settling on my face. For a long moment, the room was absolutely silent. The blaring television in the hall faded away. The smell of bleach disappeared. There was only my daughter, staring at me as if I were an apparition conjured by her own suffering. Her lips parted. They were dry and cracked. "Mom," she rasped, her voice scratching against the silence like dry leaves on pavement. I closed the distance between us in 2 strides. I didn't worry about the wires or the massive metal cage on her leg. I leaned over the bed, sliding my arms around her fragile shoulders, and pulled her against my chest. She was so incredibly thin. I could feel every rib through the cheap, scratchy hospital gown. The moment my arms closed around her, a dam broke inside her. She didn't sob loudly. She wept with the silent, gasping desperation of someone who had forgotten what it felt like to be held. "I'm here," I murmured into her hair, my own tears hot and fast against my cheeks, but my voice remained perfectly steady. "I've got you. You're safe." She clung to my coat with weak, trembling fingers, hiding her face against my neck. "He left me," she sobbed, the words tumbling out in a frantic, broken rhythm. "Mom, he left me here. He said we couldn't afford the good place. He said I was too much work. He said he had to travel for the clinic to save the business." My hands stroked her back, feeling the sharp angles of her spine. "How long, Sarah?" I asked quietly, my mind already calculating the timeline, the bank charges, the silence. "How long have you been in here?" She pulled back slightly, looking up at me with eyes so full of shame, it made my stomach physically ache. 6 weeks, she whispered. "I haven't seen him in 3. He took my phone, Mom. He said the screen was broken when I fell. He said he was fixing it. I couldn't call you. He told the nurses you were estranged and not to let anyone contact you." Estranged. The word was a weapon he had used to lock her in this bleak, sterile box, while he lived off my dime. He had silenced her, isolated her, and then walked away. "And the fall?" I asked, looking deliberately at the devastating injury on her leg, and then at a faint, yellowing bruise near her hairline. Did you really fall down the stairs, Sarah? She squeezed her eyes shut, her jaw trembling. She didn't answer right away. She didn't have to. The way her body shrank into the mattress, the way her hands curled into defensive fists. It was the universal language of a woman who had been trained to fear the truth. We had a fight, she finally whispered, her voice so low I had to lean in to catch it. About the accounts. I found out he was funneling money from the clinic. I confronted him at the top of the landing. He didn't push me, Mom. But he didn't move out of the way when I tried to walk past. He just stepped into me. And when I went over, he didn't try to catch me. He stood at the top of the stairs and watched me hit the bottom. The silence in the room returned, but it wasn't empty anymore. It was filled with a rage so potent, so absolute, that I felt it thrumming in my fingertips. I didn't gasp. I didn't cry out. I stood up straight, smoothing the lapels of my coat, and looked down at the broken child I had spent my life trying to protect. He's not traveling for the clinic, Sarah, I said, my voice dropping to a low, deadly register. But don't you worry. We are going to ensure that wherever he is, his vacation ends today. The immediate aftermath of finding my daughter wasn't about vengeance, it was about rescue. You cannot plan a war while your soldier is bleeding on the battlefield. I spent the next hour locating the charge nurse. A weary woman who looked at me with a mixture of relief and deep suspicion. I didn't waste time on pleasantries. I produced my passport, my financial documents, and the original incorporation papers for Sarah's clinic. I demanded the attending physician. When he finally arrived, looking harried and overworked, I didn't ask for an update. I asked for a transfer. She is not staying in this facility another night, I told him, my tone leaving zero room for debate. I am arranging private medical transport to the premier orthopedic recovery center in Dallas. You will prepare her discharge papers and forward all medical imaging to my designated specialist. If there is a delay, my next call is to the state medical board regarding the deplorable conditions of this room. The doctor blinked, taken aback by the sudden shift in atmosphere. Ma'am, Mr. Bennett is listed as her medical proxy. We need his authorization for a transfer. Mr. Bennett abandoned a vulnerable patient in a state facility. While misappropriating funds intended for her care, I replied coldly, leaning across the small counter in the hallway. If you require his signature, you can try reaching him on his luxury Mediterranean cruise. Otherwise, you will accept my emergency intervention as her mother and primary financial sponsor. Or I will have my attorneys file a gross negligence suit against this facility before dinner. The doctor swallowed hard, glanced at the fierce determination in my eyes, and nodded. I'll start the paperwork. While the hospital staff scrambled to process the sudden, authoritative demands of a mother who had just reclaimed her territory, I stepped outside into the sweltering Texas heat. I needed air and I needed quiet. I walked to the edge of the potholed parking lot, leaning against a rusted chain-link fence, and pulled my phone from my purse. The screen glared in the sunlight. I opened my contacts and dialed my wealth manager back in Toronto. He answered on the second ring, his voice crisp and professional. Mrs. Grant, I was hoping you'd call back. Did you review the alert I sent? I reviewed it, I said, my voice steady, though my heart was hammering a relentless rhythm against my ribs. I am currently standing outside a county rehabilitation clinic in Texas, where my daughter has been left to rot. I need a forensic breakdown of the emergency fund, Martin. Right now. I want to know exactly where David is, and I want to know who is with him. I heard the sound of a keyboard clacking rapidly on his end. Martin was a shark in a tailored suit, and he knew the tone of my voice meant blood in the water. Pulling the transaction history now, he murmured. The alert you received was for a 2-week, ultra-luxury charter through the Mediterranean. Departing from Barcelona, currently somewhere near the coast of Monaco. First-class flights from Dallas were booked 3 weeks ago. 3 weeks ago. Exactly when David had stopped visiting Sarah. Exactly when he had taken her phone. Is there a passenger manifest tied to the booking? I asked, staring blankly at the baking asphalt beneath my shoes. The booking was made through the concierge service attached to the black card, Martin replied. 2 passengers. David Bennett. And a woman named Chloe Sterling. I'm seeing matching flights, matching excursions, and an incredibly high volume of retail spending at ports of call. Jewelry, designer boutiques, high-end dining. They have drained nearly $40,000 from the medical reserve in the last 10 days. Chloe Sterling. I recognized the name. She was a family friend, a younger woman who had started working the front desk at Sarah's clinic 6 months ago. Right around the time Sarah's calls to me started getting shorter. Right around the time David decided to manage the business. The picture snapped into perfect, devastating focus. David hadn't just pushed my daughter down the stairs. He had orchestrated her removal. He put her in a place where she couldn't communicate, stripped her of her dignity and her phone, spun a lie to her employees, and used the money I intended for her safety to finance a grotesque honeymoon with his mistress. He thought he had outsmarted a widow in Toronto. He thought the miles between us were a buffer. He didn't realize that miles mean nothing to a mother with a checkbook and a grudge. Martin, I said quietly, the heat of the Texas sun entirely forgotten as a glacial calm washed over me. I want you to execute a hard freeze. The typing on his end stopped. A hard freeze, Mrs. Grant, on the emergency reserve, on everything I commanded, my voice dropping to a whisper that carried more weight than a scream. The emergency reserve. The clinic operating accounts. The joint checking accounts tied to my initial deposits. The credit cards. I want every single piece of plastic with his name on it flagged as stolen by an unauthorized user. Cancel the cards. Do not pause them. Terminate them. I want his financial footprint erased. Mrs. Grant, a hard termination while they are traveling internationally will leave them completely without access to funds. It will decline immediately at any merchant. That, I said, looking back at the bleak, miserable brick building where my daughter lay broken, is exactly the point. Consider it done, Martin said, the professional detachment in his voice masking what I knew was deep respect. The network will update in approximately 5 minutes. Anyone attempting to run those cards will receive a hard decline and a confiscate order. I ended the call and stood by the fence for exactly 5 minutes. I didn't pace. I didn't cry. I watched the second hand on my watch sweep in a silent, perfect circle. When the 5 minutes were up, I took a deep breath, smoothed my coat, and walked back inside to pack my daughter's meager belongings. The next few hours were a blur of coordinated logistics. I hired a private ambulance to transport Sarah, moving her out of that depressing room and into a state-of-the-art facility in Dallas. When they settled her into a private room with a window overlooking a garden, real sunlight filtering over her pale face, she looked at me with a weary, fragile gratitude. You didn't have to do all this, Mom, she whispered, her eyes drooping as the proper pain management medication finally took effect. I have done nothing yet, I replied gently, pulling the blanket up to her chin. Sleep, Sarah. Tomorrow, we start rebuilding. I sat in the plush armchair by her bed, pulled my tablet from my purse, and waited. I didn't have to wait long. When you cut the strings on a puppet, it doesn't just fall, it flails. I knew David wouldn't notice the freeze while lounging by the pool. He would notice it when he tried to perform. He would notice it when he tried to play the big shot. The time difference meant it was late evening in Monaco. Prime time for showing off. My phone vibrated in my lap. An international number. I let it ring. I watched the screen glow in the dim light of the hospital room, the buzzing sound a sweet, rhythmic confirmation of his panic. I let it ring out completely. 2 minutes later, it rang again. And then a third time. On the fourth ring, I answered. I didn't say hello. I simply pressed the phone to my ear and listened to the silence. MCA. David's voice came through the line, breathless, strained, and vibrating with an artificial casualness that made my skin crawl. Thank God you answered. Hey, I'm so sorry to call this late, but we're having a massive issue at the bank. I repeated, my voice perfectly flat, devoid of any warmth or concern. There was a slight pause on his end. The sound of clinking glasses and distant, elegant piano music filtered through the background. He was in a restaurant. Or a high-end store. I mean me, he corrected quickly, a nervous laugh escaping his throat. The clinic. I'm at a medical conference. In Europe. Trying to source some new equipment for Sarah's recovery. But my cards are declining. All of them. The bank must have flagged it for travel fraud. Could you call Martin and clear the hold? I'm standing at a vendor right now, and it's incredibly embarrassing. The audacity of the lie was almost breathtaking. A medical conference. Sourcing equipment. He was standing in the Mediterranean with his mistress, swiping my daughter's blood money, and he expected me to apologize for the inconvenience. You're at a medical conference, I said slowly, letting the words hang in the air so he could hear how absurd they sounded. Yes, he insisted, his voice tightening with urgency. And the vendor needs payment now. I can't leave without settling this. Just call Martin, MCA. Please. In the background, I heard a sharp, female voice. Chloe. David, what is taking so long? The jeweler is waiting to wrap the necklace. If your card doesn't work, we are going to look like idiots. I smiled. It was a cold, terrible smile in the dark of the hospital room. I'm afraid Martin cannot help you, David, I said, keeping my voice conversational, almost light. Because the cards haven't been flagged for travel fraud. They have been terminated for theft. The silence on the line was profound. The piano music in the background seemed to suddenly sound very far away. When David finally spoke, the casualness was entirely gone, replaced by a low, panicking anger. What are you talking about, MCA? This isn't a joke. Turn the cards back on. Sarah needs this equipment. Sarah needs her mother, I corrected, my voice dropping the conversational tone, hardening into steel. Which is why I am currently sitting next to her bed, in a private orthopedic center in Dallas. I moved her out of the state facility you abandoned her in, David. I have seen her leg. I have seen the bruising. And I have pulled the security footage from the clinic, showing you emptying the safe before you took your family friend to Barcelona. A ragged gasp echoed through the phone. It was the sound of a man realizing he was standing on a trapdoor and the lever had already been pulled. MCA, wait, he stammered, all pretense stripped away. You don't understand. It's not what it looks like. Sarah and we were having issues. She's unstable. I needed a break to clear my head. I was going to come back. You are not coming back to my daughter's house, I stated plainly. The locks have already been changed by a private security firm I hired an hour ago. The clinic accounts have been seized. The personal accounts are frozen. You have absolutely nothing. You can't do this, he shouted, his voice cracking, drawing unwanted attention in whatever luxury boutique he was standing in. Chloe's voice hissed in the background, asking what was happening. Half of that business is mine. I'm her husband. You're a liability, I said calmly. And as of this morning, you're a suspect. When Sarah was lucid enough to speak to the Dallas doctors, she detailed exactly how she fell down those stairs, David. She detailed how you stepped into her path. She detailed how you withheld her phone and isolated her in a county ward. She's lying. She tripped. The panic in his voice was escalating into terror. He was stranded across the world. No money, no flights, no access. And a mistress who was quickly realizing her sugar daddy had just turned into a pumpkin. That will be for the detectives to decide, I said. A social worker was here an hour ago. She documented the timeline of her admission, the lack of your presence, and the financial drain that occurred immediately after her injury. They have filed a formal report for elder and dependent adult financial exploitation, domestic battery, and criminal neglect. MCA, please. He was begging now. The arrogance had completely evaporated, leaving behind a pathetic, whining shell. Chloe is walking out of the store. The hotel wants a working card for the incidentals. I don't have a way home. You can't leave me stranded in Monaco without a dime. I looked down at Sarah, sleeping peacefully under the soft light of the monitors. Safe, protected, and finally free from the monster who had tried to break her. I thought about the 5 months of silence. I thought about the smell of bleach in that miserable county room. I am not leaving you anywhere, David, I said, my voice barely above a whisper, carrying the absolute finality of a judge's gavel. I am simply treating you exactly how you treated my daughter. Good luck on the long walk home. I ended the call. I didn't block his number. I turned the phone completely off, dropped it into my purse, and leaned back in my chair, listening to the quiet, steady rhythm of my daughter's breathing. The fallout was spectacular, though I didn't witness it firsthand. I didn't need to. Procedure, as I've learned, handles revenge much better than emotion does. The details filtered back to me through Martin and the Dallas police over the next week. Stranded in Monaco with declined cards and a confiscation order, David was forced to leave the jewelry store in humiliation. Chloe, realizing the gravy train had derailed into a brick wall, abandoned him at the hotel, using her own emergency credit card to book a flight back to the States. She didn't leave him a dime. David spent 2 days sleeping in the lobby of a budget hostel, frantically calling former colleagues and estranged family members, begging for a wire transfer to buy a coach ticket home. When he finally managed to scrape together enough money to land back at Dallas, Fort Worth International Airport, he didn't find an Uber waiting to take him back to his sprawling suburban house. He found 2 plainclothes detectives waiting for him at the arrival gate. They didn't make a scene. They quietly pulled him out of the customs line, read him his rights, and placed him in handcuffs. The charge wasn't just domestic assault. It was gross financial exploitation of a vulnerable dependent. The paper trail I had meticulously handed over to the authorities painted a picture of premeditated malice that no high-priced lawyer could easily wave away. Not that David could afford a high-priced lawyer anymore. Sarah's recovery was slow, and it was painful. Physical therapy to rebuild a shattered leg is an agonizing process. But emotional therapy to rebuild a shattered spirit takes far longer. We sold the house in Texas. We sold the clinic. We liquidated the assets that held the ghosts of David's ambition, and we moved her back to Toronto. I set her up in a beautiful, sunlit condo overlooking Lake Ontario. I didn't move in with her. I am not a hovering mother. But I live 10 minutes away, and my phone is never, ever on silent. The first time I saw Sarah truly smile again was 6 months later. We were sitting on her balcony, wrapped in thick blankets against the crisp autumn wind, drinking black coffee. The metal fixator was gone, replaced by a slight limp that the doctors said would eventually fade. She looked out at the water, her face fuller, her eyes bright and clear. "You know," she said quietly, tracing the rim of her mug, "I thought your money was the reason he stayed. I thought if I cut him off, he would leave me. I was so afraid of being alone that I let him lock me away." I reached over and placed my hand over hers. The skin was warm, vibrant, alive. "Money is a tool, Sarah," I told her, the same thing I had told myself on the flight down to Texas. "It can build a cage, or it can build a battering ram. The moment it stopped being your shield, I used it as a sword. You were never meant to buy your own respect." She nodded, leaning her head against my shoulder. We sat there in the quiet, but it wasn't the heavy, suffocating silence of an unanswered text or a locked house. It was the peaceful, golden silence of two women who had stared down the worst kind of betrayal and survived it without surrendering their grace. I didn't destroy David's life. He did that the moment he decided a woman's kindness was a weakness he could exploit. I simply froze the accounts, handed him the bill, and let the world collect the debt.